might sound theoretical, but at the most basic level, if we do not trust China, we're not going to engage meaningfully with China. And to be very frank, I don't think most jurisdictions in the West trust China. And in fact, and so that's why it's really important for us to understand trust. How do the Chinese trust certain actors? Who do they trust? Who do they not trust? Because it gives us a baseline to understand what sort of engagement we can have, what sort of meaningful engagement we can have. So despite the continuation of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, citizens perceive Russia as its most trusted global actor. And we saw this again last year. And we saw this with other types of pollings that are akin to what I'm doing here. So Russia is still very influential in that respect here. 81% of respondents express a high levels of trust with Moscow. And this was particularly apparent among highly educated, high-income respondents. And so we're looking at an elite population who actually trusts Russia as well. And for us, it's really interesting because it tells us what sort of leeway the Chinese government might have in their engagement with Russia, is that there is popular support for engaging with them. Not only do they see them as influential, but they trust them. Now, I have a whole slide towards the end about explaining this, so I'll get to that in a moment. But for our sake right now, Russia's most trusted actor. Japan and the United States have the lowest levels of trustworthiness. Japan, for historical reasons, I don't think I need to explain to anyone in this room about Japan. The United States is seen as its competitor, its global competitor. So there's a lack of trust with the United States. And this, again, is very consistent across the years I've been doing this polling. CPC members, high-income earners, highly educated respondents were more likely to express trust in the US, mind you. So it's interesting when you disaggregate it by certain cohorts who trust the US more so than others do. But in aggregate, the US and Japan have the lowest levels of trust. The EU, France, Germany, not so much. I mean, but again, akin to the United States, it's skewed dramatically. If we move to the next slide, long-term importance to China. So the survey asks everyday citizens, who do you see as a long-term importance to China's future? So in the next decade, if you want to ask the question very, in a much more conducive way. So who is the most important actor to China within the next decade? Russia. You're seeing my theme here, right? Russia, Russia, Russia. So Russia is viewed as the most important jurisdiction to China's long-term future. Again, it's consistency over the years. So this is not a blimp. They do see Russia. And there's a perception that Japan is relatively insignificant to China's long-term future. The EU as a conglomerate is seen as having greater importance to China's future than Germany and France individually. And I think that's really interesting as well, because it tells you that everyday citizens, they see the EU as an entity is much more important. And in fact, strategically, it's much more important because China can actually influence the EU as an entity more so than it can influence a singular nation. What I mean by that is, and we've seen this throughout the last few years, they can play off, say, the Eastern European states with Germany and France and so forth. So they can actually divide Europe in many respects in their interaction. So I don't think everyday citizens think about this, but it's actually within the sort of mindset that EU as conglomerate. It's much more important to China's future than the individual nations. If we can move to the next slide. The likelihood of military conflict. Despite growing tensions and ongoing disputes, 50% of respondents believe a conflict between China and India is unlikely. US-China tensions in the 2020s, it's not surprising to see 64% of respondents view a conflict between China and the US as inevitable. And in fact, that's where we see and the US comes into play a lot here. There's a question, I'll share an entire slide about how citizens want to resolve the Taiwan-China sort of issue. And most Chinese citizens actually do see a possibility to resolve this in a peaceful way if it's only between China and Taiwan. If the United States gets involved, they see a military solution as more as something much more palpable, rather. And I'll get to that in a moment, but you can see the United States as an actor is just not trusted. They see it's more likely to have a conflict with, and it sees more likely to have a conflict with interests that China has, i.e. via Taiwan. the possibility of a military conflict with Germany and France is highly remote. It's not even in the worldview, to be very frank, statistically speaking. So if you're Germany, France, even the EU, you don't need to really think about the Chinese thinking that it's going to be an actual military conflict. Move to the next slide. I want to talk a bit more about China's global roles, what citizens see China's role should be in the next decade. So let's move to the next slide. Question we're asking is, what issue area should China take an active global leadership role? And the number one issue area citizens in China want to see China taking a role in globally is peacekeeping. Citizens are supporting China's outgoing sort of efforts in peacekeeping and playing a role in global conflicts. In Israel, Palestine, I'll show you a slide on that. On Russia, Ukraine, I'll show you a slide on that as well. They want China to play a greater role for peacekeeping. That's number one. When we looked at number two here, we see technology. And that's where the source of a lot of friction is occurring, of course. Mind you, if you look at the 5-year plan, the current 5-year plan, and what we estimate the next 5-year plan is going to be, it's very technology heavy in terms of investments. And so the government's sort of initiatives, the government's sorts of plans is in accordance to what citizens want. They want China to export its technology overseas. And it makes perfect sense that we see there's an alignment there. So peacekeeping, number one, technology is number two, in terms of where China should take a global leadership role. We go to the next slide. And this is the question that a lot of jurisdictions are asking. Should we limit? Well, no one's actually asking, should we expand cooperation? But many of our jurisdictions are saying, should we limit? Should we decouple? Should we de-risk? Decoupling makes no economic sense. De-risking, perhaps. But let's just see what citizens in China think. Akin to last year's version, rather than being especially pro or anti-decoupling, the Chinese public really have a preference for expanding global economic cooperation and technology research collaboration. There's a willingness to cooperate with everyone, statistically speaking. There's a willingness to cooperate with the EU as a whole. Germany's an outlier for technology research collaboration. But for the most part, we see the Chinese public being very pragmatic. They do want to collaborate. They do want to cooperate. They do not want to de-risk or decouple. So there's a great source of support within China for actually further engagement, particularly in economic realm and in technological research realm. So it's a very different picture than many of Western jurisdictions are facing, where they're talking in cabinets, you're talking within the government bureaucracies to de-risk or even decouple. So there is overwhelming support among the public. Move to the next slide. Attitudes towards China's global engagement. Ask a series of questions, and ask response rate their agreeableness between 1 and 7 about foreign affairs and global relationships. And basically here in this slide, I'm asking, statements such as, should China concentrate more on domestic affairs than on global matters? And is China currently too open to foreign influence in thinking? And really what we see at the end of the day, the most important things here is that citizens do not want to change norms and values globally. They do not see that they need to export norms, Chinese norms and values globally. What we do see, though, is that China should cooperate more, that China should be more cooperative, that China's models should not be exported. So we see a very clear sort of picture here. Interestingly enough, China should increase its global military presence in order to further improve national security. There's more of an agreeableness there. So if there's any defense individuals in the room or anyone who's interested in that, there is support among the Chinese public to increase its military spending, which interestingly enough, the state has done so in this last budget. So we see citizens are well supporting that. It could be for peacekeeping, but also for other Chinese national interests globally, that is, to support that. We move to the next slide. I'm going to say a few words about tourism, study, work, and immigration preferences. This will be a quick one. Continue to the next slide. So basically, one of the questions we've been asking is, where do you want to, in the next decade, where would you want to visit? Where would you want to study? Where would you want to work? Where would you want to emigrate? And interestingly enough, for tourism, Europe does well here. So we see France and Germany are very attractive points of destinations. It maintains that. For studying, we see that basically Germany and France are still well seated as destinations of choice. The UK is seen as much more interesting as a destination of choice. United States, not as much. Canada and Australia, not as much. And we're seeing that decline, if I was to show you last year's one as well. So we're seeing a decline in the attraction of the US and Canada and Australia as a destination of choice, which gives a gap for the European Union, or European Union nations to actually fit into. So if you were to think strategically, it might be interesting to actually try and attract more Chinese students if there's a willingness to do so, because there's a less of an interest going to other jurisdictions, the traditional ones where they went to Australia, Canada, the United States. And there's a lot of refined data on this on the website if you're interested in looking at it. Working, citizens don't want to actually leave as much, which is interestingly enough. But if they did want to leave, and to work, that is, you do see Germany and France as a wonderful destination of choice, Russia as well. I'll explain that in a moment. But Russia does play prominently there in terms of a point of working destination. Immigration, people have less appetite to emigrate, to migrate out of China. But if they were to migrate, they do see Canada as an option, overwhelmingly so. And then we see France and Germany are the 10% each, respectively. Again, you can get the breakdown based on demographics, very different demographic variables for this data as well, if you're interested. Let's continue onwards. Now, sources of knowledge of global jurisdictions. Where are Chinese citizens, everyday citizens, getting their information from? How are they learning about the world effectively? And if I was to reverse the question, how can you influence them? Because if we know where their sources of information is, we can try and figure out how do we influence that perception. And if we move to the next slide, knowledge and trust is something I was looking at here. Generally speaking, the more knowledge you have of an entity, the more likely you are to trust the entity. I can show that statistically. You notice I didn't give you a lot of regression analysis here. So it's non-academic in many respects, but this is probably the only one up. This is the only one I'll put up here. There's a strong relationship between the knowledge you have of a state and whether you trust a state. It can be bad knowledge, it can be negative knowledge, but more knowledge, generally speaking, you have of the nation, the more likely you're to trust the nation, other than the United States, which is the anomaly in all of this. So jurisdictions, and then you can see here, who they felt most knowledgeable about was the United States, Japan, and Russia. Response were less likely to be knowledgeable of Australia and Canada. If you look at the European Union, if you look at France and Germany, it's still on the bottom. So they don't have a meaningful awareness of the EU, Germany, and France as much as you think they should, relatively speaking. Relative to the United States, the UK, and Russia, and Japan, we do find that the knowledge levels are much lower. And that can be a wake-up call for, it's definitely a wake-up call for Canadians, my home country. It's a wake-up call to Australians. So it should be a wake-up call to us in Europe as well, whereby there isn't as much meaningful knowledge about these countries. It's very superficial. And remember, this survey is not only looking at the major centers. It's not only looking at Beijing and Shanghai, the cosmopolitan areas, shall we say. It's looking at the rural areas. It's looking at a lot of the Western provinces. It's a statistically valid national survey. So you're looking at what everyday citizens think who may not be, quote, elite citizens. They generally don't have knowledge of our jurisdictions in a very meaningful way. So it shouldn't be surprising to see they don't trust us as much. If we move to the next slide, sources of information. Basically, I'm looking at traditional media versus social media. So we have television, radio, newspapers, social media. Irrespective of cohorts, we find that people get most of their information through social media about the world. So there's a couple of implications to this. First implication is the party has a harder time controlling social media than it does traditional media, relatively speaking. They still can control it, but it's much harder to control social media and the messaging on social media than traditional media. So if on television, on radio, particularly on newspapers, you can actually give directives to the editors about what you may want to publish, where you may want to stress, and so forth. You might get weekly or daily directions on that. And so that way you can actually have party messaging, state messaging that's accordance to what the messaging in the newspapers and traditional media. In other words, you can actually influence the population's perception by virtue of that sort of messaging through traditional media. But if the citizens are getting most of the information about the world through social media, it becomes harder for the party to actually control sort of messaging. It's still possible, and they still do so. But it's relatively speaking, it's much more difficult than traditional media. What it also tells us is if you are a Western jurisdiction, or if you are a non-Chinese entity and you want to influence the Chinese public, social media is one of the ways to do so. And you can do that. It is possible. It is very, very plausible. There's people in this room who probably know how to do it very well. And so social media is a way in which you can change the perception of how they perceive your own country, your own jurisdiction, or certain issue areas. Now, in other studies, I've looked at the ideology of individuals in China and looking at how, by ideology, I mean how they see the world, how they see their everyday, how they see their communities, and so forth. So looking at how fixed or unfixed it is, well, you see there's a range. And the range is quite elastic based on their sources of information, usually it's through your own family units, through your own social groupings, or through social media. And it changes your perception, it gives you that range to change your perception. So it's quite elastic. That tells you, in other words, if citizens are getting most of their information about the world through social media, if you're a state and you want to influence how your state is perceived, it is quite possible for you to actually influence it in a very short time. So, I mean, even though you do see this perception might be positive or negative, you can change the perception. Again, you can see the different variables here in terms of age, education, residential location, employment status. It gives you the same sort of messaging insofar as social media is how people see. This is where they get their information about the world. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about Russia. I'm going to talk about a few of the conflicts. Let's go to the next slide. How do we explain the Russia effect? Time and again, we see a greater cozying up to Russia, and it comes up in most of the questions we ask. Russia is the most trusted. People want to migrate to Russia. People want to work in Russia. It's like, why would you want to work in Russia? And it is puzzling because, the conversations I have with colleagues, some are ex-diplomats, they would say, this doesn't make any sense. It has no sense. I mean, it could be a fad. It could be because, Russia's standing up to the West and they support the West. And it's a great way to showcase a disagreeableness with the West. But the data shows us something that's quite entrenched. Now, I would suggest there's a pragmatic reason. As the West pulled out of Russia, it gives more market opportunities for Chinese to go into Russia. And so it's a pragmatic reason. So you want to have greater business opportunities in Russia because there's more business opportunities in Russia because the West pulled out. So we saw this last year's survey. We saw even this year's survey. We also see that, yes, of course, this idea that standing up, having a new sort of, or rather an old new sort of new other way of doing things globally, a new sort of paradigm or old new paradigm that's attractive. It's very appealing to youngsters. So we could see them on the younger generation. They see, again, Russia standing up to the West as appealing, an alternative. But I think it's much more strategic. We see that there's more and more information about Russia in China. More so, and so there's a greater trust as a result. And we see this particularly in the rural populations. We see this outside of the Eastern Seaboard. We see this particularly about Chinese citizens who self-report knowledge of Russia impacts their trust, and there's an effect size there. We see information on social media, it's much more positive, so it can actually reinforce things that they were thinking about anyways. There's a gender variation. Men tend to trust Russia more so than females do. Location, as I said, rural citizens tend, not statistically, there's no statistical significant impact on your propensity to trust Russia, but we do see, for the most part, in aggregate, that rural populations do support Russia more, although it's not statistically significant level. We go to the next slide. If you look at Sino-Taiwan reunification, citizens broadly want a diplomatic reunification with Taiwan. In fact, 2/3 of citizens indicated this. Again, I mentioned this beforehand, if the US is involved, then things change. If the US is involved in a diplomatic reunification, citizens are less supportive dramatically. I mean, you can run the statistical regressions on this, but you don't even have to because it's so dramatic. So 68% of respondents want a diplomatic solution with Taiwan. If the US is involved, 32%. And they would actually support a military solution. So if the US is involved, they support the military solution to actually reunify Taiwan. The elections didn't influence it. So one of the ways I ran it just before the election and after the election to see if things will change, didn't matter. And so we do see that this is quite consistent. If we move to the next slide. China's role in global conflicts, Russia, Ukraine. Chinese citizens are generally ambivalent about the conflict, even as they readily identify Russia as losing strength during the course of the conflict. The support for China playing an active role in resolving the conflict is highest among middle income and less educated respondents. Respondents who believe that China's interests have been affected by the conflict are more likely to support China playing an active role in resolving the conflict. Support for China's involvement in this conflict, there's a gender dimension to this. Females generally do not support it as much as males do. But then that's quite consistent across jurisdictions, not only a Chinese phenomena. If I was to put this in greater context. Those living in rural areas were more likely or less likely to support any potential Chinese involvement in resolving the conflict. If we move to the next slide, we can talk about Israel-Palestine. About half of respondents agree with China having an active role in resolving the conflict, which is quite significant. Can you imagine if I have to run this poll a decade ago, you wouldn't get these kinds of results. Citizens actually want China to play a greater role in global conflicts. Now, you need to think about that if you are a policymaker or involved in foreign affairs. That tells you China is going to be an actor. It tells you that China has very strong support domestically to play a major role. So it has the domestic support, it has the citizen support, it's increasing its military budget, so it allows you to have hard security and have hard power globally. And so you have this coupling, you have support domestically, you have the capacity to do so, and there's a willingness to do so by the state. So China in the 2020s is going to increasingly play a role in global affairs. Now, where it might become problematic, if you're a Western jurisdiction, then we have different ways of doing things than we do. So we need to be aware of that. And you need to think about how to engage with China on that. Because China's uniquely positioned for some of these conflicts, particularly Russia, Ukraine. It's a great example there. I am just giving you, of course, what the citizens think and what citizens want, what the support for what citizens want the state to do or can do. So they do see a willingness for China to be a global leader in peace and security. And particularly those who do express that do see an interest in China playing an active role in resolving Israel-Palestine. Citizens don't actually tell me how to do so. They just tell me they want China to play a role. So that's another story to be told here. Respondents' primary source of information on global affairs do not appear to have a significant impact on their perspective on this issue. So irrespective of its traditional media, social media, through personal conversations, generally speaking, we see these results being well maintained. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So one of my final words. The surveys are really telling us what the hopes and ambitions are for local, everyday Chinese citizens. And how China should play a leading and active role in global affairs and international affairs. This public has a desire for China to be an active global leader. And again, this is coupled by the fact that there's increased spending on military, increased sort of overtures globally in other economic affairs and technological affairs. So we're seeing citizens want China to go out more so, and much more abruptly. And in spite of ongoing tension between China and the EU, the public did not express an interest in pursuing comprehensive economic and technological decoupling. In fact, they want to engage with the West more so. Of course, respondents are steadfast in the belief that they need to deepen economic and technological ties with Russia, suggesting a high level of resilience in Sino-Russian bilateral relationships driven by strategic interests, shared strategic interests. Now, one of the things that particularly during COVID is that we had less and less engagement with China from the West. In other words, we reduced trust levels between China and a lot of Western jurisdictions because there simply weren't as much meaningful contact. So that's one of the things we need to do in parallel in terms of pursuing our own national interests, pursuing our own regional interests. We do need to have greater cultural connections and people-to-people ties, which can actually create greater trust. Because going back to the basics here, we need to have a baseline level of trust with China and vice versa for us to engage meaningfully. A lot of the things that China does is what other countries do. And we don't have an issue with those other countries because we trust those other countries. And so I think that's something we need to think about a bit more as we try to think about how to engage more fruitfully with China, because that's something we can't avoid.
Thank you very much. Shall I? Whatever you wanted to say. Why don't you stand over there? That's easier.
Thank you so much, Reza. And as well known from you, as I certainly expected, you have bombarded us with a very significant amount of really interesting data. Now, I'm more of a qualitative researcher myself, so what I would like to sort of go into is a little bit, you already started doing it, but perhaps it's useful to tease out a couple of further lines of understanding is, what do we actually get out of this data in relationship to a number of stories about China that we believe in, or that we believe that Chinese people must believe in? And so my first my first question was going to be about Russia, and you already sort of preempted quite a lot of that. But I do feel that there's this sort of remaining niggling irritation that, what is it that you trust? Because one of the things that I was missing a little bit about there is something about, call it global stability or some sort of an equilibrium or some sort of global order. If we were all in China having this presentation the other way around, we'd all be talking about how for the US and Europe, they seem to be spending a lot of time talking about the liberal rules-based order or whatever we might want to call it. But there is such a thing as global ordering. And from our perspective, we would say that Russia has significantly endangered the stability of that global ordering by essentially conducting a highly illegal invasion of another sovereign state, with all kinds of economic, security, military, and humanitarian consequences. What is the sense of this global ordering on the Chinese side? And is this, what does it tell us about the Chinese citizenry if they seem to be condoning, supporting what we might see as, playing fast and loose with the stability of the world or the well-being of quite a number of people? What is that story there? And then in the a second thing that I was thinking about was, what is the degree of connectivity between some of those issues? For instance, when we talk about perceptions between regions, certainly in my interactions with Chinese interlocutors, one of the things that I'm always noticing is that even Chinese foreign relations experts very rarely see Europe as a sort of autonomous entity. To put it quite impolitely, very often we are essentially perceived as the little wagging tail of the American dog. And so we are usually not accorded, an independent status. So to what extent is a relatively low level of trust in Europe connected to a relatively low level of trust in Europe? And maybe as a more actionable question also for government people in the room, if that is a problem, what is it that we might start thinking about in terms of how do we address that problem? How can one convince, if one thinks one needs to convince certain audiences in China about the fact that we really are, at least in some ways, autonomous? Or are these just sort of well-established commonsensical beliefs that are going to be as difficult to remove as a particularly hardcore wisdom tooth? And then the last question is indeed about this growing sort of willingness for China to play a global role. And you put it yourself in the presentation, and it gels with sort of what I've been finding in my own research, is that at least at the level of political elites, I see considerable hesitancy among Chinese ruling circles about the idea that for China to be a global power means to do essentially what the West has done since 1492, right? Our idea of being a global power is we go into the world and we change the world into our own image. And we used to do it with missionaries and religion and Christianity, and then we did it with civilization, and now we do it with human rights or the World Trade Organization. But we try to sort of reshape the world into what we at least think we are. I've always found a great hesitancy among my Chinese interlocutors for China to do the same. That's not their game. But there is a sense where, and there is a sense where you say, indeed, the Chinese public isn't necessarily either on board of a project that would ascribe a sort of global civilizing mission to China. But there is this idea of military strength. And so the question is, what is that military strength for? Is it basically an act of national virility where you say, you have aircraft carriers, so we must have aircraft carriers? Or is there something more there in terms of China has growing foreign interests, and those foreign interests must be protected, whether they are Chinese nationals and Chinese investments in countries around the world that might not necessarily always be as peaceable as we might hope them to be, or is it about at some point, developing some sort of interventionist strategy? This idea of what is that military for above and beyond? Look at our beautiful ships and tanks and all the rest of it. And then the last question, I really like your point about people-to-people ties, and it's something that I've experienced myself as well. I've been working on a lot of Sino-European interactions, particularly in the field of technology, and the absolute lack of even the most basic levels of dialogue, be it at the sort of expert specialist scholar think tanker level and at government level, is frankly shocking. And I believe that if we expand that contact surface, we might help a little bit in terms of mutual learning, whereby we might at least calibrate some of the concerns that we have about China. But I'm sometimes a little bit afraid, and this is slightly going beyond your presentation, but I would like to hear your reflection on this. Again, what is enlightened engagement for? And it seems to me that we've gone past the stage where we could use where we could use sort of diplomatic tools as a stand-in for diplomatic strategy. Because the strategy was always that the tools will generate a particular result. China will become more like us. China will be integrated into a global trading system. China will become a responsible stakeholder. To what extent do those people-to-people ties, or should they perhaps also serve another strategic objective, and that is that we actually need to come to a more realistic engagement policy about China itself, where we do not expect China to essentially convert to our proverbial secular religion, but where those people-to-people ties, maybe the best we can do is manage tensions, given the fact that China is not going to go away, and we need to come up with some sort of a strategy based on the idea of some sort of peaceful coexistence, and that peaceful coexistence is very likely going to be quite uncomfortable. Is that also, if we cannot solve those problems and achieve enlightened engagement, but where, might that then also be a part of a viable China strategy for European? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. A few comments, perhaps.
So thank you, Roger, for the 4 main points here. First one is about global ordering. And I always upset international lawyers when I'm about to say this, so I apologize in advance. I've always thought there's a myth of global ordering. And in fact, I think it's something that from 1989 onwards, if you were schooled, you would think, there's only one sort of global order. And that's what it is. And it's triumphed. And that's all that we know. You just have to go back to our recent times and our recent history, pre-1989. There was never a unified global ordering. It's just blip in human legal history have we had that. We've always had numerous kinds of kind of orderings, shall we say. So to suggest that there is a global ordering that China should abide by, I think we need to think about it much more holistically over historical times. It's a very particularistic view to think that there's only one ordering. And China, and I think Russia, and many other countries in that sort of light do subscribe potentially to another type of ordering or another type of norms and values, which might clash with ours. That's not to say that you cannot have both, because we've generally had both or had multiple orderings beforehand. We can exist. I mean, even in times of Grotius, if we want to go back to historical legal sort of doctrines, this has always been the reality. So for me, you need to have basic levels of trust to engage with different orderings. And this actually relates to your point about, the people-to-people exchanges. For me, the people-to-people exchange is about establishing basic levels of trust, minimum levels of trust in each other. We might have different ways of doing things. We might have similar ways of doing things. We might have subscribe to different kinds of approaches, but we need to have minimum levels of trust in each other to engage with each other. I mean, think about it for Singapore, which is a semi-authoritarian regime by most political science standards. We have no issues engaging with Singapore for the most part, but yet they have a lot of attributes from a bureaucratic standpoint similar to China. And we have issues with China. And it comes back to trust, it comes back to predictability, it comes back to understanding those regimes in a meaningful way. And I think that's what lacks in many jurisdictions in the West, and vice versa, to be very frank, is that understanding. So people-to-people exchanges provides us an opportunity to further engage with that minimum levels of trust I was talking about beforehand. You talk about connectivity. And when we talk about EU and how the EU is pretty much, is in sidestep with the United States, I think that's something that EU and its EU member states need to play a greater role in actually having a better sort of brand in China, a distinguished brand in China. And there's leeway to do so through social media, for example. You do have to brand yourself much more distinctively than the United States. You may have similar norms, similar values, you may have similar practices as the United States or Canada or Western jurisdictions, but yet you should brand yourself differently as though you've independently come up to these conclusions. Now, this is a difficult proposition to do. I'm sure if you go to the EU entities, or if you go to national governments within the EU's embassies, they try to do that. They try to have good public diplomacy. But it's difficult because you need to be much more refined in China. You need to, again, just through social medias and so forth, that's one of the ways to do so, to change your public diplomacy and your public affairs model. In fact, that was one of my first jobs, was actually as a public affairs officer for Canada. I know how difficult it is. I was stationed in Australia. And in Australia, I mean, this was back in the early 2000s, there's this idea in Australia that Canada is a backward country. And that drove me nuts. Like, how can we be a backward country? How are we not technologically advanced in the Australian mindset?
So different from Australia.
Wow, that too, at that time. Interestingly enough, there's always a lag of how people see another country. It takes, at that time, it's about a decade or a lag into what reality was. But so it also takes time. So when I do these pollings, I'm thinking about, well, this is how the public views a lot of these countries a few years ago, because it takes time for the everyday citizen to actually see what the reality of the country is at present day. So in other words, that's a positive way of saying to you, if you're doing a lot of work from the European member states or even the EU as a conglomerate and trying to change your perception, it's going to take many years to see that coming fruitfully into a lot of these pollings that I'm doing, looking at how China sees these countries. So it takes time. There's always a lag, but you have to change your public model. You need to continuously change that to showcase that you're not the same as the United States, it's just you so happen to have similar conclusions through your own independent processes. So people-to-people exchange is one of the best ways to do that as well. It ties into your comment there. The last thing is about military strength in many respects. And, it's not, let's not be naive here. Citizens want a peaceful rise. The government actually espouses a peaceful rising China, and many variations in their documentation. If you're increasing your military spending, if you're increasing your hard power, this is in order to actually protect your own interests. All states do this. Let's be very clear about that. All states are trying to protect their own interests and act within their own interests. And by increasing your military spending, et cetera, it's one way to do so. But and you might have a different way of doing things that might clash with us, but you still need to have minimum levels of trust. And again, China's behaving the way most states behave. It's not unique. And so we shouldn't be surprised if they're doing so. They're trying to actually improve their own national interests. But we need to have trust and vice versa. And again, that's why the people-to-people exchange idea is so important. I hate the term, to be very frank. I cringe when I say people-to-people. But at the end of the day, what it means is we really need to have beyond high-level government interactions, we need to have business-to-business interactions. We need to have civil society-to-civil society interactions. And it is possible in civil society interactions, even though we might think it's not. That's a talk for another day. That's another specialty I have. But it is possible through 3 sectors of society, state, business, private enterprise, and civil society, to have those meaningful interactions where you generate minimum levels of trust to engage. You don't need to be best friends, but you need to have minimum levels of trust. And in all 3 or 4 things that you mentioned, it requires that trust, that minimum levels of trust, which we seemingly don't have at this stage. And for me, that's the most alarming thing at this juncture. How do we envision a world where we're engaging with China if we don't trust China at a minimum level? They don't need to be our best friends, just at a minimum levels of trust to engage.